today, here we have his latest book, Abraham Lincoln and the Power of the Press, The War for Public Opinion. Simon & Schuster is the publisher, 733 pages illustrated, and it's $37.50. And as I'm saying, this has got to win, to me, the 2015 Lincoln Prize. It has so many wonderful stories in it, first of all.
Thanks.
That you've unearthed. There's so many of them. And punctuated by true insights. And that's really the important part of this. You've gathered so much, but at the same time, there's so much insight from years of living with Mr. Lincoln. First of all, how did you get all the material for this? Did you have researchers to help you?
I did use researchers, I have for a while now, but not to probe collections in search of material. I sort of use them for what I call directed research. That is, I'm interested in a clipping from the Chicago Press and Tribune from August 31st, 1859. Can you get me a hard copy so I can keep it in my files and use it? As opposed to look through the Chicago Tribune and find great stuff that was published during the Lincoln era. I find the great stuff.
Yeah.
But my wife and I also did a couple of years of work. Edith, who's here today, we went to Washington, we went to Springfield together, we did research together, not only in hard-to-find newspapers on microfilm, cranking away or using the electronic advance till our eyes were falling out of our heads, but also in the papers, many of which are kept in the Library of Congress, of some of these forgotten editors, and amazing stuff to be found in terms of what they say about Abraham Lincoln and how they think they're winning the battle for public opinion over him while he's really winning it over them.
Yeah.
So that's how I did the research. It took a long time.
I bet. But it's synthesized greatly, and I'm glad Simon & Schuster allowed you to put as much in as is there, because it's compendium as well of Lincoln and the power of the press and the press of the day. It's compendium for that as well as just an interesting, fascinating read.
I think they were a little surprised at how long it was, because the contract called for a word count that I exceeded by 50%. When you say 700 pages, I have a lot of end material, a lot of footnotes, a lot of... I for the first time...
My readers read those.
I know, well, good, because I put a lot of effort into them, and I tell some stories in there that are a little diversionary from the main text. It pains me to take them out of the main text, as you can tell.
Yeah.
And
but
actually,
that's a good way to do it, to put it into the end so that at least it's there.
And I can take credit for it later if someone misses it.
That as well.
But also, I've never done a bibliography before, because most Lincoln historians just use endnotes, and they suffice. But someone once said, I was rather disappointed that you didn't have a bibliography. I don't remember for what book it was. So this time I kept a running bibliography, and that's another 35 pages, but it's there, and it's got, for those who are interested, a good list of original 19th century books on journalism. For those who are interested in that aspect of the story, I think I've got something that'll be helpful.
That's why it's a great compendium. It's a useful piece for research as well as an interesting read.
That's what I was hoping.
Now, this is at its core a story of incestuousness, let's face it. Politicians and journalists.
Wait, I want that on the book jacket. That'll help.
We could do that. And why do they want each other's job?
Because they were doing both jobs simultaneously from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And it is incestuous. And it's hard to imagine that kind of thing working today. It's about a period in which newspapermen were politicians. Politicians were newspapermen. And if they weren't acting in both roles, they were working together for the same political ends. Why? Because they all wanted power for the causes to promote the causes they believed in, but also because there was financial reward in those partnerships. Newspapers that supported the Republican Party would get government advertising, government printing contracts if the party won, and their editors were likely to get other rewards, particularly from Abraham Lincoln, as we discover in this story. When Lincoln became president, he He made so many editors, diplomats, and postmasters that it's amazing that any newspapers could be published after his inauguration, including right here in Chicago. John L. Scripps, the senior editor of the Chicago Tribune, became the Postmaster General of Chicago, with lots of patronage of his
He
own.
wrote this.
The Tribune tract Life of Lincoln, a co-production of Republican editors, John L. Scripps and Horace Greeley.
Greeley's name is right at the bottom.
Right. But this is the Scripps life, right?
Yes.
And Lincoln was... Campaign biographies are interesting, and our friend Tom Horrocks has just written a book just about that. They're the equivalent of media today.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as we speak, here in Chicago on November 1st, the television screens are filled with commercials for the upcoming Senate and gubernatorial elections here. You've noticed, I've noticed. And these little biographical tracts were the equivalent of paid media. And the fact that they were written by pro-Republican journalists in behalf of Lincoln is instructive about how those worlds intermingled in the 19th century.
Well, talking about this incestuous thing, I mean, let's go straight to Mr. Lincoln then. What a wonderful story it is that most people don't know is that he also published a paper, a German language paper.
And what I find interesting is all these guys owned papers, or the owners of papers lusted after or ran for office without any shame at all. But Lincoln had some scruples about this. He may have been the only guy in the country who felt a little constrained. So in 1859, a year before the presidential election, worried about harnessing the growing German population, converting them into loyal, not only Republicans, but Lincoln men, secretly purchased a German language newspaper, which was published just through the presidential election. The agreement being, which Lincoln wrote up himself, even though lawyers are not supposed to be their own lawyers, right? It means they have a fool for a client. He wrote his own contract. And all it stipulated was that the editor, the German editor, would have to be loyal to the Republican platform, Theodore Canisius, whose name Lincoln could never spell. But he's not the greatest. I
pronounce it Canisius anyway. So that's my
he spelled it with 3 S's instead of 2, right. All he had to do was be loyal. At the end of 1860, he'd get the paper back and the printing press, everything. And Lincoln kept his word, gave him the press back, and made him consul to Vienna in the bargain. Mm. He didn't speak German, so I hope he was, and we have no copies. Anybody out there who has a copy of the Illinois Staatsanzeiger, bring it into the Abraham Lincoln bookshop. Dan will put it on sale, but I'll get to look at it before he sells it, because it just has completely vanished from central Illinois and from history.
Yeah, it's true. Now, there were many images of Lincoln, and you talk about newspapers being the tool of his trade.
Right.
And he goes back with Mary to this when they were courting through a tool of their trade, because they were both interested in this.
And both wrote for newspapers and got in trouble over it.
Exactly. Here are 2 photographs you use in your book, in the frontispiece and on the dust jacket. There were 4 that I remember at least, artists and photographers who caught Lincoln with a newspaper. Mm-hmm. Here on the left is Polycarpus von Schneidau here in Chicago. On the right is Alexander Gardner, and also Albert Hunt and Pierre Morand both caught him with newspapers with the tools of his trade. So it was always in his life from Mary on.
Pierre Morand is interesting. I didn't use it in the book because
it's against a tree where
it's hard to get. He's in Washington, outside of the White House. He's run out to buy his own newspaper, which he did occasionally when he was curious, and leaning against a tree reading it. These great photographs, which you've had printed in enhanced positive prints, I call it like the CSI versions, get so much out of them, are just amazing. I mean, here's Lincoln on the left, as you point out, in Chicago in 1854, fresh from a speech, wearing that ridiculous bow tie, by the way.
Yeah, shoulder to shoulder.
Looks like it's holding his head up. It's so gigantic.
And a Brillo pad on his head.
But what is he holding? And the reason we say the tools of his trade is because this was an era of occupational photographs, when a blacksmith would pose with an anvil and a fireman would pose with a helmet and a hatchet, and here he is with a newspaper. Other newspapers adapted it. At least 3 newspapers were used for that photograph or reprinted it. This is the Chicago Tribune version, right?
Well, let me ask you a question about this. because when this version came 4 years later off an ambrotype,
Right.
and Joseph Medill, here in Chicago with the Chicago Trib, wanted to show off the senatorial candidate that he was pushing, and Mr. Lincoln, and so he PowerPointed in Press and Tribune, and if you notice, it's actually that masthead is down further on the page because his finger would have covered up the masthead.
Very clever.
So, very clever.
But originally it was probably a German language paper in Chicago.
Most likely it was the Illinois Stadtzeitung, George Schneider's.
Right.
Now, it was solarized out so you couldn't see what it was. If it had been known that he had an abolitionist-leaning newspaper in his hand, would that have stopped his career right there, at least from being president?
It would have hurt him in the Senate campaign for sure, and in the debates, because Douglas was trying to pin the abolitionist mantle on him, which was dangerous in those days. Just that one on the left, because the one that you took down, the gardener. Here he is in Washington posing for 5 or 6 photographs in the summer of 1863. Doesn't have much time for reading papers in those days. So he takes the Washington Sunday Chronicle to look how big that paper is. Talk about broadsheets. They don't make them like that anymore. Even the broadsheets aren't as big as that. And between poses, he's catching up on the news. And that was the most loyal. He doesn't pose with anti-Lincoln Democratic newspapers. And all of them were party papers. So this is a loyal Republican pro-administration newspaper, and he's maybe showing it off a little bit too.
Maybe. But let's talk about partisanship, since you've just brought it up. You speculate that George Washington was surprised that there were papers against him.
In the second term, yeah.
In the second term.
That's why he didn't serve for life. Too much criticism.
He may have. You would say he may have been dissuaded from another term. It certainly dissuaded Lyndon Johnson. I'll tell you that. But tell us of the rise of the party press. Just a brief overview, not a
Not a treatise. Okay.
Exactly.
You know, it's hard for me to do a brief.
I know that's why I mentioned it.
So, really, in the Jefferson-Adams election, that was the beginning of Democratic and anti-Democrat, Republican-Democrat, and anti-Republican-Democratic newspapers. Growing through the Jacksonian era, newspapers were either Democratic or Whig. Every town had 2 newspapers, one supporting Jackson, one supporting the opposition. And that just grew in intensity, readership, as the technological revolution brought telegraph news and steam printing presses, until this cottage family industry, well, it wasn't even an industry, business of newspaper publication, mostly weekly papers, became a national industry with daily newspapers, with people thirsting for news the way they, look at their cell devices today for updated information. But all of it came through the filter of partisanship. What they got in news was either Democratic or Republican. There was no such thing as nonpartisan news in the Lincoln era.
Can there be? I mean, human beings are political animals. Can there really be an objective newspaper?
Well, the New York Times today thinks it's objective. I'm sure the Chicago Tribune thinks it's objective. Do I hear laughter in the audience? Surely reacting to something else. But today's newspapers endeavor to be partisan only on their editorial pages. Supposedly the news pages play it straight. Television is more like the 19th century newspaper. The problem is that Fox and MSNBC won't admit what they are, whereas the papers of the Lincoln era gloried in the fact that they were pro-Republican or pro-Democratic. So we need Rachel Maddow and Bill O'Reilly to tell it like it is. I am a Republican, I am a Democrat, and by the way, I may run for political office tomorrow and keep my day job, which is what these 19th century guys did.
Now, we'll get to the big 3 that you're talking about as well. What about Europe? How did they have the same sort of press? I know Edward Dicey came in 6 months in the federal states. He wrote a 2-volume, and he was a bit surprised at what he found here.
Yeah. Europe basically had national newspapers. We've never had much of a national press in this country. We have regional press, we have political press, municipal press. The London Times was called the London Times, but it was the national British newspaper. So yes, everyone who came here from Europe, Dicey, William Howard Russell, who came here as a correspondent from the London Times and was, astonished at the hostility he engendered from northern readers by calling the Battle of Bull Run a defeat and a disaster. He was really between July 61 and February, March 1862, he was basically run out of the country by fellow journalists on the Republican side who iced him out and just kept him from access to stories or were very unfriendly, including the big three we'll talk about, and by the War Department, which wouldn't give him a pass. So, a pass to the front. Threw him off a ship once, by the way, when he was trying to get back to the battlefront.
Is democracy just that messy, and in Europe too autocratic?
Well, without commenting on Europe, because I'm not really an expert on the 19th century in governments or politics in Europe.
About society,
but we were a fractious society then. We're a fractious society that now. It was raucous. People regret the fact that politics is so negative now. It was much more negative in the 1850s and 1860s. The difference is that the raucousness of the 19th century produced 80% turnout in elections. Whereas now, negative television commercials are used to repress the vote. So I don't know why negativism doesn't excite people and why it depresses them now. We're so negative anyway, we might as well just embrace it and go to the polls and express negativity if you don't want to express positivity.
That leads to depression. I just read in the paper that depression leads to Alzheimer's, so I don't want to do that. Here is a Whig extra, a newspaper extra. Show it to you real quickly. And give us a quick overview. What was the difference between the dailies, the weeklies, and where do the extras come in?
During political campaigns, well, first of all, newspapers which started as weeklies were desperate to have their printing presses not idle, always churning and always making money. During political seasons, they produced these extras, as they were called, which were campaign newspapers, even more flagrantly partisan than the regular newspapers, and often more profitable, filled with ads, thousands of readers. At one point down in Springfield, they published extras that were more popular than the Sangamon Journal or the Illinois State Journal. So they were also a staple of political life in America. You showed it to me very, very briefly. Is this Vicksburg?
This is Vicksburg.
What year?
In 62.
Wow.
So it's early on.
Well, that's pretty amazing because it's on the eve of the siege.
That's right. Exactly it. And
When,
not,
of course,
and
they
not
had-
on wallpaper either. This is actual...
It's a little pre-wallpaper, but that's a
yeah,
nice
actually
piece.
have paper there.
Dan always shows a few pieces that he thinks I'm going to buy after the conference. ends.
That's right. This is really a selling tool. That's all this is. I want to read you something that I've been waiting to take this and fits in right here. Chicago Sun-Times, the Trib. Eric Zorn wrote about the Sun-Times that at the beginning of the political cycle this time, they decided to retreat from saying you should vote for this guy or you should vote for that gal. They said, we quote, "We have come to doubt the value of candidate endorsements by this newspaper or any newspaper." They added, "Our goal, when we're not too much on our high horse, is to inform and influence your thinking, not tell you what to do." Although maybe, as Bjorn has pointed out, influence is telling you what to do, maybe. But that's what they say. Then, a couple of weeks later, for various reasons, they changed course. And then they said, "For every reader who has commended us for standing on the sidelines, seemingly hundreds of others have asked, 'Who's going to tell me how to vote?'" Now, what does that tell, first of all, about the electorate, perhaps, and also about newspapers? Where do you go on this?
Well, all newspapers are desperate to keep their niches in a changing society when platforms have taken the place of newspapers. We're again meeting on a day when the Sun-Times has sold a lot of papers to the Trib and all this complicated things I read about this morning on November 1st, 2014. So they're having problems, and maybe trying to be more nonpartisan was their way of attracting more readers. I think it's really interesting. I didn't know about this, but that hundreds of people
That's what they
objected
said.
and want the guidance. Now in New York, I have to tell you,
Well, I don't know if that's true. Here's the next sentence that Eric
Yeah.
says. "Right, just like the seemingly hundreds of readers who clamored for me to write this column."
they try to have it both ways, every way. In New York, in our last mayoral election, every newspaper endorsed the same person in the Democratic primary, and that person wound up with less than 10% of the vote. So it doesn't mean as much as it once did. But I'll tell you, in Lincoln's day, people carried their newspapers and their ballots to the polls. And by the way, there was no such thing as a secret ballot, because if you're in Chicago and you carry the Chicago Tribune to the polls and say a green colored ballot, it's pretty obvious you're going to vote Republican, because you have to do the colored ballot in the right glass bowl, which is open, clear. And if you carry the Chicago Times, you're clearly going to vote Democratic. So people were prouder about, and obviously had more fealty to party organizations than they do today.
Yeah, that they did. Jim Haney from Lawrence, Kansas, and Jim, thank you for this question. And it's one I kind of was going to ask you as well, very briefly again. Just what informed you to get to the place that you're at with this book right now? Because you come through the press, and I think that's very vital to the knowledge in this book. So he asks, how much do you think your work, your profession in public affairs with MoMA influenced your interest and selection of research for this topic on Lincoln? I think it's in your DNA. And what most comes to mind that you learned from your research that applies to working with today's media? But first start out with what influence.
First of all, I'm obviously not doing my job well enough if the acronym MoMA is being used, because MoMA and I have a local friend here who's worked for both MoMA and the Met before he came to work for the Art Institute, so he knows, he's laughing at this. But it's the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I was informed and inspired to do the book, as you guessed, by my own career, which I started as a journalist of sorts for a very small weekly newspaper, but learned about newspapers from the newspaper business out. Then I became a political press secretary, so I learned about what political organizations and candidates do to try to get journalists to cover certain things, editorialize about certain things, going to editorial board meetings. I was in dozens and dozens of those. At one of which one of my candidates pounded the table so hard that a Pulitzer Prize fell off the wall and crashed to the ground. I won't say who the person was. But so obviously I learned from that. And 22 years at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a wonderful job. I don't have to sell too hard, because it's, excuse me for saying this from Chicago, but the greatest art museum in the world. And
not by the polls, but go right ahead.
That's true. It's not by the polls. You guys won that poll, didn't you?
Yes, we
did. Well, obviously Chicago does vote. That's good news. So I did learn.
Most of our dad voted for that.
Yeah, right.
That's true.
I did. So I did have that experience behind me, as well as 40 years doing research on Lincoln. So this was really a labor of love and a confluence of interests and, I hope, expertise. What was the second part of the question?
For today's media, how do you approach today's media? Does it apply to what you've learned? Does it apply to today?
Well, it's very different today. First of all, Lincoln was amazed at how the daily news cycle captured American lives, and how he had to deal with a daily news cycle. And people ask me whether he could have mastered the 24/7 news cycle, and probably, because he understood communications and he understood how to deal with people. But what we deal with today, what political leaders deal with today, is totally unimaginable. First of all, because of the constant chattering on television, on Twitter, on Facebook, there's no forgiveness for any kind of error. What would have happened if an American president had suffered a bull run today? Would they have lasted 4 years and been reelected? I'm not sure. I'm not sure they would have survived. So that's a difference, and I think the pervasive media coverage has created an intolerance. But I suspect people in the Civil War would have felt the same thing about the daily newspapers, that it was making life impossible, making experimentation unlikely, and making the margin for error ever smaller.
Going back to the publishing aspect for Lincoln, you have a stunning phrase in there that I'd like you to explain. You call Lincoln a press Führer, quote unquote.
Did it make the final book?
It did make the final book.
Okay, some people objected to that.
That's why
because
I'm
actually,
not that I object.
Well, my copy editor, said look up in the Oxford English Dictionary the rise of the word Führer, that it's actually too modern a word to be used in a 19th century context. Although people write very glibly and in the vernacular in history books today. So, but listen, the guy published a German language newspaper, so I figured it was warranted. And what I meant by it is that he was dictatorial, not only in repressing newspapers, suppressing newspapers, but in befriending the ones who were ostensibly supporting him, but who occasionally went off the reservation. He punished them. He withheld advertising. He withheld patronage. He embarrassed them publicly, and he put his big hand on their shoulders in personal meetings and charmed them. He knew how to keep these guys under control, and he worked it all the time. So maybe Führer is not the right word, but I did like it because of the fact that he owned a German language newspaper that he couldn't read.
There you go. I'm going to show Henry Ward Beecher's photograph here, signed actually. I'll hide
What a
behind
great
it
piece
here.
that is.
That's great, isn't it?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
just an amazing photo, and he signed it too, which is nice. But I want to talk about, I want to get to Lincoln's character actually in a couple of questions here through Beecher.
They had a love-hate relationship.
Well, you write that Lincoln battled his whole life with press acclaim, battled with it. You write of his hunger for press accolades. So when he died, they found an article in his pocket by Beecher giving him accolades.
Yeah.
Is this narcissism on his part?
Oh, sure.
Good.
Absolutely. I mean, he kept his good notices like an actor who got critical praise in a play. And it was in his wallet and in his pockets, along with a charming pair of spectacles that was sort of knitted together by a piece of string because he didn't want to buy a new pair of glasses. Beecher was a critic, and he became a newspaperman during the Civil War. He took over an editorial role with the anti-slavery New York Independent and pushed Lincoln on emancipation, criticized him for not recruiting more African Americans for the service, and one day in the White House, Lincoln has tried not to read critical editorials for a while. This is 1864. And an artist is with him on a Sunday making sketches, and someone cruelly, almost, maliciously sends Lincoln the collected recent editorials of Henry Ward Beecher. And he reads them, one after another, while he's posing for the artist. And then he takes them and slams them to the floor and says something biblical, "Is thy servant a dog?" Which is right out of the Bible, meaning what am I going to do to be accepted as someone who's trying to do the best I can? And then he sort of lightened up after the explosion. But Beecher was difficult for him. And someone he paid tribute to when he went to New York for the Cooper Union address. He went to the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, which still stands, attended worship services. It was a tourist attraction in those days. In fact, he was supposed to speak at Beecher's church, wound up at Cooper Union because he was delayed so much. And he was in the audience. This is a segue, but I love this story. And Beecher is doing his sermon, and people are hearing in the audience, and everyone's trying to figure out where this noise is coming from. They look around, and it's this tall guy in the 6th row. The pew is marked with a plaque today. And he's responding in the old Baptist tradition. He's talking back to the sermon, and they don't do that in that church. So it was a very interesting moment, and witnesses wrote about it.
Going on to character, I once had J.G. Holland's biography of Lincoln came out in 1866, one of the first biographies to come out after the assassination, and everyone bought it. It's impossible not to trip over it in the streets, as far as I'm concerned. But I had Ward Lamon's copy. Ward Lamon being Lincoln's associate from Illinois, one of the Long Nine, and if he may have been able to stop the assassination if he had not been sent to Richmond. He was kind of a bodyguard.
He said so, right?
He says so. Now, Holland said that Lincoln was honest, talked about his honesty, and in the margin, Lamon wrote, Lincoln could stretch the truth when necessary. Holland said that Lincoln loved everybody. Lamon said he loved no one but was kind to all.
What
do you think about Lamon's assessment of Lincoln through your eyes?
I think Lamon is absolutely right. And Lamon performed a newspaper service for Lincoln that nobody else was able to do. I write about it in the book. I discovered it almost accidentally. Lamon got a great job in the Lincoln administration. He became Marshal of the District of Columbia, meaning he was a federal marshal like Matt Dillon. And as such, he for some reason was overeager about returning fugitive slaves to Confederate territory when they showed up in Washington. And Horace Greeley wrote this, the editor of the New York Tribune, wrote this vicious editorial about Ward Hill Lamon, saying he's a buffoon, he's whether he was Lincoln's B.B. Rebozo or not, that's open to discussion. But Lamon sued him for libel. And Greeley complained that since he didn't have the money to hire a lawyer, it kept him out of Washington for 6 months. That was an enormous relief to Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. So that's my side story about Lamon. But Lamon knew him extremely well. We may not have full reliance on Lamon's own book, published in 1895, really written by his daughter, although it has some great stories in it that I must say I used. But
his daughter or Chauncey Black?
No, his daughter, Dorothy. Dorothy Lamon Teilhard. Mm-hmm. Some of the books say Dorothy Lamon, some of them say Dorothy Lamon Teilhard, her married name. Black may have done the earlier version, then his daughter took over and created more stories. Right. But stretching the truth, and Lincoln loved no one, ... but himself, and was kind to everyone. I think that's a terrific character statement and interpretation. And he's writing it in the margins of a book published right after the assassination. So
right after.
That's great stuff.
Going back quickly for the partisanship, and you speak about how the New York Times today tries to be at least objective everywhere else but the editorial page. Back then, was there any newspaper one could go to feel you could get nonpartisan news, or really was all of it 100%?
You didn't want to go to a newspaper that had nonpartisan news. You wanted to buy a paper that would reinforce your own ideals and prejudices. If you hated African Americans and didn't think they should be part of society, certainly shouldn't bear a gun in the army, then you read very conservative democratic newspapers. If you thought that freedom would improve American society and opportunity and create a bridge to opportunity, then you read Horace Greeley's New York Tribune or Joseph Medill's Chicago Tribune, and there wasn't much conversion going on except through immigration. But you could not find a nonpartisan newspaper. They were those who pretended to be nonpartisan, like the New York Herald, were easily unmaskable as pro-democratic or pro-republican sheets.
Well, let me ask you this then: the Civil War could have broken out any number of times in prior decades, but it broke out then, and maybe it's Abraham Lincoln that finally, the line in the sand ain't going to go any further.
Right.
But you're talking about a new journalism that had been invented at that time. And to that new journalism, maybe quickly tell us what it is, and we'll get to the big three right after that. But did that finally push it over the edge of that journalism?
I think it helped. I think that's a really good point. I actually haven't thought about this since I wrote this section of the book. But there was a strong, moderate old Whig journalism in the Upper South, in Virginia, in North Carolina, and in the border states, that believed in the sacredness of the American Union, as did Lincoln, and didn't think the mere fact of his election was enough of a trigger to justify breaking up the Union and separating and becoming a different country and possibly in provoking war. What happened is that secessionists drove those editors out of town. We have the eyewitness accounts of editors who fled, as any Union person would flee from Richmond, let's say, or the wives who were actually some wives who were left behind as the guys fled, and then they had to pack up their households and join these misguided pro-Union editors wherever they went. That's why Union armies had so joyfully destroyed printing presses when they got into the South, including in Vicksburg. So yes, there was the firebrands who took their place, or the firebrands who existed before, like Robert Barnwell Rhett in South Carolina, who was an editor as well as a secessionist politician. They really incited the population. And Lincoln always believed secession sympathy in the South was a minority sentiment to begin with. It was just too convulsive a step to take. But with relentless editorials saying the election of Lincoln is a declaration of war, it was in the papers every day. How was secession announced? It was announced by the Charleston Mercury in a special handbill headline, and a copy of which was sent to Abraham Lincoln as almost a threat. The Palmetto Boys signed it, and that's in the Lincoln papers in Washington. So, yeah, newspapers incited before they reported.
Yeah, but that was, and then of course the same Rhett, of course, put out the Union is dissolved, and
yep,
there
that's
it was.
That's his paper, right?
That's
Charleston
his paper,
Mercury.
right? So Let's get to the big three
Okay.
for a little bit because
With apologies to Chicago, because I do write a lot about Joseph Medill.
You do, and I was going to say that there's a
In
lot
Chicago.
in there, but frankly, I'm tired of hearing him from yesterday and today
I'm
and
glad
the
to
day
know
before.
you.
You know,
I'm
so
glad to know you like my previous talks.
I
That's
love
good.
them, but I've inculcated them.
Enough
So
already.
read the book about Joseph Medill. We may talk about him a little bit anyway, but the big three publishers had nicknames as well. Horace Greeley of the Tribune was called the Old Philosopher.
That's to his face.
Okay,
Right.
all right. You'll tell us behind. Henry Raymond of the Times, the Little Villain, and James Gordon Bennett
His
of the
Satanic
Herald,
Majesty.
His Satanic Majesty. Did they fit those nicknames? Any caveats?
Well, Raymond was little. We'll start with the oldest guy first, the guy who started his newspaper first. James Gordon Bennett made the New York Herald into the first tabloid, the first successful tabloid in the country. Really cheap newspaper, a small one that everybody could hold, filled with crime stories and provocative local stuff, but also brilliantly, stock market reports, theater reviews. He was a brilliant, brilliant businessman and a very good writer. So the newspaper was extraordinarily popular, and he invested in it. He wasn't a cheapskate like Mr. Greeley, who we'll get to in a minute. He put more reporters into battlefields in the Civil War than anybody else. He spent fortunes on locomotives to transport news and his own telegraph system. So a genius, but very conservative. Anti-black, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic Church. He called the Pope an idiot. He started a fight with the Archbishop of New York. Very provocative. So I think the church stuff is what earned him the nickname, His Satanic Majesty. Deeply involved in Democratic politics, even though he insisted he was nonpartisan. He was a Tammany Hall supporter and supported Democrats for president, governor. The difference was he never quested for office. He was Scottish born. He was never going to be president of the United States, but he was a character and ruled newspapers in New York in many ways, hence the majesty part. So a man who would not be his partner was Horace Greeley. And he went on to found a newspaper that didn't make it, the New Yorker, no relation to the magazine, and then ultimately the New York Tribune in the 1840s. The Old Philosopher, not just because he was an anti-slavery man and a sincere anti-slavery man who preached freedom for most of his career, with a few bumps in the road, but because he adopted all these faddish causes over the years and philosophized about them. Everything from vegetarianism to spiritualism to brand cereals to utopian socialism, and constantly talking about new ideas, some of them pie in the sky. And he dressed in this white coat, paper spilling out of his pockets, a battered top hat, one pants leg tucked into his boots, the other out, and he would amble from one side of the sidewalk in New York to the other, and people would say, "Mr. Greeley, where are you going?" And he declaimed he didn't remember. I think he created this character that bordered on caricature. So he was the Old Philosopher.
Now,
Not
both-
Professor Irwin Corey, before
No.
Professor Irwin.
But he and Lincoln didn't look like much, did they, until they opened their mouths?
They didn't look like much. Greeley had a terrible speaking voice. He always wanted to be an orator.
But people listened to them when
They
they
do,
spoke.
yeah. They said they really got to his gigs early so they could be in the front and hear him. Here are two people who met in Congress. Lincoln served one term. Greeley was appointed to fill a vacancy. The only time he served, he was dying to serve. He ran for the Senate, governor, lieutenant governor. He was always thwarted. But here are two people born in a log cabin, each a different log cabin, obviously. One in the Northeast, one, of course, in Kentucky. Both hated the physical labor required of their farms, read newspapers voraciously. Greeley was apprenticed to a newspaper, but they had so much in common. When they met in the house, they should have become allies and friends, and somehow Greeley didn't get it. He didn't get the humor, he didn't get the jokes. He thought Lincoln, he said later, there are a number of Whigs representing the West in Congress who I would have picked out first to be president of the United States. He saw nothing in Lincoln, and he was a thorn in Lincoln's side for the entire course of the presidency. He was a thorn in Lincoln's side during the Lincoln-Douglas confrontation because he thought of supporting Douglas, because at least Douglas hated Buchanan. It was a very tempestuous
And
relationship.
just off the cuff here, was he as much a thorn as Adam Gorowski?
Yeah, because Adam Gorowski had no power. Greeley had immense power. The New York Tribune with its national edition. Adam Gorowski was a gadfly observer of Washington. So one of his employees was an upstate New York college grad, which is pretty impressive, named Henry Jarvis Raymond, the youngest of the three. Greeley employed him, paid him very little, fought with him about salary increases. Eventually, Raymond broke off. He claimed because Greeley was too prone to these fads and went off the reservation when he should be more loyal to the Whig platform, and he founded nothing less than the New York Times and became the ultimate politician editor. The little villain, Greeley named him that because he quit. But the little villain served as an assemblyman, as Speaker of the New York State Assembly, as Lieutenant Governor of New York, and in Lincoln's re-election campaign, 1864, as I say, he hit the trifecta. He was chairman of the Republican National Committee. He was a candidate for Congress from Manhattan, and he wrote a 700-page book, a campaign biography of Lincoln. That's like managing the paid media. And he kept editing the Times throughout. So that he was the quintessential politician editor.
Now, who were the most influential press people on Lincoln? Syntax is wrong here, but nonetheless.
For or against?
Either way. I mean, who influenced Lincoln? Did any of these?
Oh, who
three?
influenced Lincoln?
Who influenced Lincoln? Exactly it. Who did he go to? Who did he feel comfortable with, if any of them? Did any of these three or anyone else fit that mold?
You know, it's a really great question, and
Most of them
maybe the last three I'm not too sure about. No, but the reason I say it's a great question is maybe it's something I should have addressed more specifically in the book. But Lincoln didn't take advice from people. Lincoln gave advice to people. Lincoln filtered his own views and messages through the press.
But he did listen. He did read.
He listened and he read, but he was reading about how they were reporting the course of political events.
Yeah.
Lincoln's idea of influence was to write an anonymous editorial and have it published, even when he was president-elect. John Wayne Forney, the guy who published the paper that we showed in that 1863 photograph by Gardner, which Lincoln is holding in his lap, had a column that he ran, a sort of a gossip column. Lincoln would contribute items to that gossip column when he wanted things published. You know, in his congressional days, he read the National Intelligence or the main Whig paper, hoping to be mentioned. And when it was tough to be mentioned, I think he resolved that he was going to work harder at getting his message across through the papers. I mean, Greeley's ardent anti-slavery position, I'm not sure it influenced Lincoln, it pleased Lincoln. And Lincoln went on to keep Greeley on the reservation as best he could when Greeley abandoned emancipation. So I'm not sure anybody really influenced him before his boyhood. I'm sorry, before his presidency, maybe a few, but certainly not when he was president.
Political cartoons were a big issue as well at the time. Of course, Europe as well as here, and pretty vicious in their own right, although they seem to have more nuance sometimes because they were political cartoons. Were all the big three were all put into political cartoons, weren't they? How did they react to that, and who was lambasted the most?
Well, Bennett, because he looked funny, he had what was called, they called him Old Squint Eye because he had some sort of a roving eye, as did Lincoln, but he wasn't called that, was caricatured, always as a Scotsman with a kilt or with a tam, because people want to remind him that he was foreign born, which was, half unacceptable. But they loved being in cartoons. Greeley was a staple of cartoons from the 1840s on with his battered hat and later he grew this corona of a beard under his chin that became another signature. And he appeared to remind people that Lincoln was radical on slavery. The mere sight of Greeley was supposed to connote that Lincoln was a radical. And they all, they were so colorful looking that they all were easily identifiable. I use a lot of those cartoons.
Yes.
The odd thing is that cartoons were not published in the daily papers. They were only published in the picture weeklies, which I get to a bit in the book, but less than the dailies.
And also as separates to be put on the wall, no?
Absolutely, and Greeley was Currier and Ives' favorite. Currier and Ives was published across the street from the New York Tribune, and they used Greeley as a positive figure and a negative figure, always with the battered hat, always with the sloppy-looking coat, always the philosopher.
You give a great little story about Greeley putting an ad in Bennett's paper. How come Bennett allowed that, and would Greeley have reciprocated?
No, Greeley wouldn't have reciprocated. He was taking advantage of the fact that Bennett famously said anyone who pays cash can advertise, and he didn't limit it. Prostitutes, fakers, patent medicine purveyors, anybody who paid cash was. And so when Greeley wanted to publish an ad for his, I think it was his national edition, Bennett couldn't say no. He was challenged. They had like circulation challenges. Greeley bet that his paper had a bigger audited circulation. He lost the bet, claimed it was a fraud. I will say that I talk mostly about how these papers reacted to Abraham Lincoln, but they spent even more time attacking each other than they did attacking or praising Lincoln. The circulation wars were vicious in New York.
Were there any newspapers outside New York? I know it's tough as a New Yorker to look at the rest of the country, but were there any coming from the west to the east or the south to the north that had influence as well? Tribune here with Medill and Ray, I presume.
Well, I found a couple of comments from the period of people who said, I don't understand why all of the newspapers from New York moved west and south, and none of the other papers seem to move to New York. So one reason they did is because newspapers in the West needed the New York commentary to reprint. The transatlantic cable was gone. It failed. So the Tribune and the Herald and the Times all competed for foreign news. In fact, as ships were coming in, each of them had a separate little boat that would speed out to the ships to try to get the news first. Eventually they got their own one big boat and pooled the resources. But they had the foreign news. It had to come west. And then each of the big three published a national edition that was extremely popular. And that's how Lincoln stayed close to the New York press, is through those national editions, particularly the New York Tribune, which he read voraciously.
Going out of your book for a second again, since I have you here, you are in a museum filled with artifacts.
Right?
And you see them every day of your life. Would you, just for a moment, speak to the importance of artifacts? Why are people drawn to them? How do we learn from them? People curating them for the next generation. Give us an idea about artifacts in your life and should be in ours.
Well, they're tangible touchstones to the past. They're things that were in the presence of the people who shaped our future, saved our country, or fought against our country. But it's a particularly important question to ask in a period when virtual reality has taken on such a force and is by some judged to be of equal importance to reality. And it's important because it's a mass communications tool. But you cannot recreate, it seems to me, and to take it to a Metropolitan Museum level, you can't recreate on the World Wide Web. Although you can get lots of information, lots of background, lots of close-up angles, which are great. You can't stand in front of a bust that Augustus Caesar actually posed for unless you're there with the original. And we have those. The Art Institute has relics of things that, the Grand Jatte that Seurat painted has been in Ferris Bueller, but seeing it in Ferris Bueller is not the same as standing there as Ferris Bueller did. See, I got a Chicago example in
And
there
there
too.
are artifacts behind us here. These are the sort of things that people love to have and hold because you can hold them, and even show them off, or should I say, locally. The people, collectors, are embedded in communities, and that's what I like about collectors, because they share, and many times it's the first time an adult, let alone a child, can hold something real.
But think about Lincoln's attitude toward these things. This is a guy who was supposedly very modest about his appearance and about his own successes in life. And yet he signed autograph albums, he signed photographs for people. These are tangible relics of how people held him close in a period when other people hated him tremendously. But he allowed, he tried to be modest about it, but he allowed artists to pose him from life, photograph him with unheard of frequency as the technology made photographs more intimate and more revealing in a period when he was otherwise obsessed with work and wasn't doing anything but work, because he knew the importance of these artifacts. They knew how important they would be then and how important they would be in the future. Why did he pose for Edward Dalton Marchant in the White House for a painting signing the Emancipation? Why did he pose for 6 months for Francis Carpenter for the great painting in the Capitol of the first reading of the Emancipation? Because he wanted to be remembered through these artifacts, through the print versions that multiplied and was sold in such great numbers. He wanted to be remembered as an emancipator. And that's why he cooperated. And that's why people cherish these things then. And they're rarer now because people settle for virtual reality, but there's nothing like the things that existed during his day, to me. Yeah. I hope to many people.
Well, I showed you an artifact before the show. I just got an autograph album. It was a great time for autograph collecting. People try to get autographs all the time. Today, selfies, some say, are taking over from autograph collecting. But this particular album started out, for the first page, if you remember, was Forney and Greeley.
And Forney was a newspaper man. He's the owner of the Washington Chronicle.
First page.
Yeah.
Then came Lincoln.
2 newspapermen before the politicians.
That's right.
You couldn't have told me about this before.
No, I just
got it. That's
Sorry
what you always say. I just got it.
The last 3 books I've just got, I know.
It would have been a good little story.
Maybe your book brings them out from the populace. Yeah, that's what it is.
I think it's fascinating that, you know who owned this album, an official in the House of Representatives, but he went to the newspaper guys first.
Yeah. Interesting. And first page, before the president.
Before
Usually,
the
as you
president.
say, they
usually
put it
Lincoln
before.
is first. Yeah.
But let me ask you: this album, though, were all the men who voted in the 13th Amendment. That album was changed the Constitution. And how much of an influence, again, did the press have at that time in passing the 13th Amendment?
Greeley and Forney were hugely supportive of getting it done. Greeley, in fact, used his floor privileges as a former congressman from the 1840s to actually go onto the floor of the House during that House vote. I wish I had known that when I was a script consultant to the Spielberg movie, because I think it would have been fun to show him crashing in his outfit and annoying the conservatives, but he was there because he wanted to be part of it. And maybe that's when the autograph was obtained, don't you think? Forney had privileges because in addition to publishing not 1 but 2 newspapers, one in Washington, one in Philadelphia, he was also, Lincoln got him a job, Secretary of the U.S. Senate. So he was just on the other side of the chamber and maybe ambled over to the House to watch the debate. So it's quite an album you have there. If Steven Spielberg is watching, this is something you ought to have.
Ditto, I say that.
Right.
Ben Bradley just died, and we buried him last week. Washington Post editor, and of course of Watergate fame. Was there a Watergate-style problem? Was there a Ben Bradley problem for Lincoln at all during the war?
Well, Ben Bradley, I was thinking about this yesterday because at a previous venue, I thought I was going to be asked about Ben Bradley. But he epitomized 2 aspects of 19th century journalism, old-fashioned journalism, and yet escaped a third element of it, something we haven't brought up. On one level, he was very cozy with politicians. And we all know that he was very good friends with the Kennedys, with President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy, and got a lot of inside information and supposedly did not publish things that he could have ordered his reporters to cover during the Kennedy years. Certainly that's true of pro-Lincoln journalists in the 19th century. And yet, on the other hand, when it comes to revealing something that a Republican president was guilty of, he was in there fiercely, giving his journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, leeway to cover a story that shook the nation and might have destroyed the Washington Post. The only level at which he doesn't epitomize the Lincoln era, I think, is what would have happened to Ben Bradley if he was conducting that kind of an investigation against the Lincoln administration during the Civil War. he would have wound up in the old Capitol prison. Because the one aspect of Lincoln-era journalism that we haven't addressed is press suppression. And the military... Oh, okay, shall I wait?
Yeah, because we're at
I was on
an
a
end
roll,
that I
but
want
I
to just talk for a moment. You'll be on a roll again. I first want to say thank you to a number of people. I'm going to put you to work, in fact. I want to sign a few of these. I don't know if you can do that yourself or not.
I can do it. I don't know if I can talk and do it, but
No, you don't need to, because I'll do it for you right now. Just want to thank a number of you who have purchased books already, because that's what helps publishers send people like Harold here. And I just want to thank a few. I can't thank everyone. We have a lot of books that were ordered. Kane in Ottawa, Illinois, and Gary in Sewickley, Pennsylvania, Tom in Fairview, Oregon, Robert in South Perth, Australia. We thank you, Robert. Brent in Charleston. First of all, how many journalists, what percent of the journalists, perhaps, or how many were actually imprisoned during the war? It was at Fort Lafayette, the American Bastille, as it was known.
in Brooklyn Harbor.
In Brooklyn Harbor.
I mean, it's very hard to do statistics because we don't know how many newspapers existed as our base, but 200, I counted 200 incidents of suppression, either the post office denying mailing privileges to dissenting Democratic newspapers in New York, to mob attacks in Maine and Massachusetts and Providence, Rhode Island, to imprisonments in the border states. One of the most ironic examples is a man named Francis Key Howard, who was arrested and thrown into Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. What's ironic about that, aside from the fact that it's pretty brutal, is that his grandfather was Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner when he saw the rocket's red glare over that same Fort McHenry, where his grandson now finds himself into prison. We know that Lincoln knew about it because we have documents that he resists releasing some of these people unless they serve a good amount of hard time and sign declarations that they won't be obstreperous in the future. So you have newspapermen recanting and suddenly converting to the Republican cause, or at least neutrality. And it's shocking. It's unbelievable.
Well, how many of them were really just doing their jobs as Democratic press and pressing a little bit the government as they're supposed to do, and talking about it? They were that sensitive that even they were thrown in?
At the beginning, the
After
papers
Bull
that got
Run,
in,
you
yeah,
said,
well, even before. After Sumter, the papers that got into trouble were those who dissuaded people from volunteering. Lincoln issues a call for 75,000 volunteers right after Sumter. Democratic newspapers that say don't go, they get the first wave of suppression. So, and those who, dissuade people from obeying the draft calls of 1863, they get suppressed. Right here in Chicago, General Burnside, who'd had a lot of trouble conquering Southern armies, has no trouble conquering the Chicago Times, breaking into the office, arresting Wilbur Story, the editor. So it's everyone trying to find to cross or traverse the fine line between dissent and treason. And did they ever define it? No. Horace Greeley, maybe to his credit, although it was a fool's errand, after the Chicago Times episode, which Lincoln countermands because people in Chicago were really upset that the Democratic newspaper was shut down, even Republicans. So Lincoln countermanded the order, and then he later said, I don't know if it was right to countermand the order. I should have left him in prison. So Horace Greeley calls a group of journalists together to create a manifesto. What is dissent? What is treason? What are the borders? We believe in a free press, but we don't believe that newspapers have the right to undermine the government or the army. Certainly not to give aid and comfort to the enemy, but also not to discourage enlistment. I mean, not everybody signed on to it. They sent this document to Lincoln so he could review it and maybe issue a government decree. Lincoln ignored it. The House committee summoned editors and journalists to Washington, some dragged out of their beds to testify. What do you think of censorship? What episodes can you relate? And I was lucky enough to stumble on this and to read all of many of the transcripts, all handwritten transcripts, happily in a scribe's very good hand, as they say. but amazing stories of interference. So the committee recommends that maybe we should establish guidelines. The full House ignores it. It's just too challenging and too uncertain. And the country is facing ruin. It's facing dissolution, and they know that. And so the free press is put to one side, and it's ad hoc all the way, and scary.
Yet you say it was no pogrom.
It was
and
not a pogrom.
that you don't really condemn Lincoln, especially, and you give counterbalancing views for Lincoln. It was not an overreaching policy, you say. It could have been worse, and in fact, you're saying it gave the press new life.
Well, the Civil War certainly gave the press new life, and I think what I respect Lincoln for is his willingness to experiment, his defense of it in some of his public letters to newspapers. He believed that journalists who, gave enough information to Robert E. Lee's army about where General Meade was in 1863 were guilty of something more than publishing editorials that were critical. Did they go too far? Sure. So, the underlings went too far. Did Lincoln go too far in signing an order in 1864, closing down the New York World for publishing a silly bogus proclamation? Yes, he went too far. Although he suspected that there was a leak in the White House about a proclamation that he was in fact writing, calling for new enlistees. What I find amazing, and frankly a relief, because I want to respect Lincoln's relationship to the press, I go in clearly with a Lincoln bias, is that anytime there was a political campaign, whether it was the midterm elections or the presidential campaign of 1864, Lincoln was totally hands-off. Papers that criticized him as being a baboon or a dictator or a tyrant or an imbecile or a closet integrationist who was, heaven forbid, going to create a biracial society in America, they were never interfered with during the campaigns because Lincoln really believed in the sacredness of the political process and understood that newspapers had to be part of that process and they had to be freely a part of that process.
So one might say that we were very lucky to have Lincoln and not some upcoming emperor be ahead of the government at that moment.
I think the free press might have died altogether, and we would have got left with Izvestia or something like that in TASS, Pravda. Those are vanished names, aren't they?
They are.
If Lincoln had not sought a balance, because Jefferson Davis was imposing an iron will on Confederate newspapers. There was no dissent, and that industry soon died out anyway for lack of manpower and printing materials.
Weren't there some newspapermen, though, that were saying that, is there really a free speech in the Bill of Rights? And how were the Bill of Rights looked at that time?
Well, Lincoln addressed the First Amendment in his usual homey way. You would always sacrifice a leg to save a body. He said this in a letter that was published in the newspapers. But you would never kill the body to save the leg being the Bill of Rights, and the body being the body politic.
Yeah,
So he was willing.
said freedom of the speech carries no speech sanctity.
No special, yeah. The amazing thing about it, I mean, if every Republican editor in the country had said this is outrageous, our colleagues in the Fourth Estate have to be protected no matter what they're saying, it might have been different. It might have stopped in 1861, but they didn't. Henry Raymond, certainly James Gordon Bennett, who was frightened into being a supporter of suppression, and Horace Greeley, to his credit, the last of the big three to fall into line, said that there is no special guarantee of free speech in a revolution, a rebellion, that there was fealty to the government itself that had to take precedence. So the Republican press applauded. I mean, I think part of it was they loved the idea of Democratic newspapers being destroyed so they could have more readers. Mm-hmm. But they absolutely supported press suppression.
Again, kind of briefly, since we're in Chicago, I just want to ask about Joseph Medill, who he said, in not these terms, invented Lincoln. He made Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
So why didn't he have more influence on him after Lincoln went to Washington?
Lincoln was always very wary about Illinois having too much influence. When people said you ought to appoint this or that Illinois into the cabinet, he said, I don't need them. Illinois has me. And he disappointed some of his supporters by not filling his administration with more people from his home state. And Medill was furious. I mean, his partner got the postmaster generalship, but he wanted influence. He wanted more of his own friends to get jobs. He didn't particularly want to leave Chicago. And he got furious. He wrote a private letter to his partner saying, "We made Abe, and we can, by God, we can unmake him."
Well, that's
and
throwing the gauntlet.
It's throwing the gauntlet. He didn't share it with Lincoln. He wasn't that foolish. But he did go off the reservation a bit during the draft period, and he criticized the draft when it was, and Lincoln got very angry at him and called him a coward to his face. When Medill made the mistake of going to Washington to criticize Lincoln to his face, he got a tongue lashing from Lincoln about loyalty, because Lincoln expected loyalty from Republican newspapers, and Medill went home with his tail between his legs and went hewed to the party line after that without any more warnings. But he was a great newspaper man. He rescued a dying press operation. They say when he took over the Chicago Tribune, the printing press was run by a blind horse that went around in a circle. He invested in steam presses. He modernized the paper. He took in new partners. He got very involved in the Lincoln-Douglas campaign. He proposed Lincoln-Douglas debates. He paid for stenographers to take down Lincoln's debates. He and Charles H. Ray, his managing editor, not only reported on the 1860 convention here in Chicago, they influenced delegates, they wooed delegates for Lincoln. So they were kingmakers, not just supporters and friends.
Oh.
And all Lincoln ever did for them was give them $4 for a subscription in 1855.
All these stories are in this book and oodles more. I mean, it's just, as I said, a compendium, so that one doesn't need to do this again. Here it is. I want to go into something else just to end this program. J.G. Randall, as you know, wrote a famous little pamphlet called "Has the Lincoln Theme Been Exhausted?" And that's now decades old.
Yeah.
60s.
And Mark Neely did a famous update of that. And then Matt Pinsker did an update in 2009.
Because it's still an issue in a way, but books still keep coming out. Thank God, here in the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, but nonetheless. So Randall says, I'll proffer one. So what else is needed is what I was going to ask. I've been proffering one to you. I think we need a catalogue raisonné of Lincoln photography. That, I think, is essential to have. Mm-hmm. And we just need to redo the whole Lincoln book. Ostendorf did a great job and it's still useful, but I think we need to expand that. What else do you think needs to be done in the Lincoln world that we've not gotten to?
If I knew, I would have staked a claim. So the Lincoln theme, I don't think has been exhausted. I may be exhausted at the moment, but the Lincoln theme is not exhausted. So I'm actually on the prowl. I spent an hour before this video conference began looking at your shelves, looking for something that would trigger another idea. But I don't think so. The young historians who are out there working on social history and women's history and new versions of military history have got some great things going, as you can just look at your schedule and see that the books continue to come, and I hope they continue to come from me as well as from the others for a long time.
We hope so too. I'd like to get you back here again. So here's a book that has got to be on your shelf. It's essential, I think, and should be a prize winner in a number of areas, frankly. So, Lincoln and the Power of the Press, the War for Public Opinion, and it's a book you've got to have. So.